Just waiting for the connection. Hello.
Good morning.
Good morning to Dr. Chris Stevens, Headmaster at Bradfield College.
I'm sorry if there has been a delay there for you. I'm not sure what was going on. I suspect technology at my end rather than yours, but I'm pleased to be here now. Thank you.
Don't worry, I'm getting quite used to talking utter nonsense for the time filler, so I'm becoming a professional at talking rubbish. Thank you for your time. I was just saying to our audience how kind it is of you to join us during half term, so thank you for that. And I'd love to share your snapshot of your morning so far, because I thought that was very amusing.
Well, it's an interesting half term. We're slightly delayed compared with other schools. We have a 2-week half term, and so this week, when a lot of people are back, I actually started the day with a governor's meeting, or rather a series of meetings online with the local maintained school, the academy where I'm a governor. So I met 6 of their pupils and 4 of their staff to talk about their online experience. And this is the bit in the middle of a sandwich. And then at lunch, I'm attending the Tempus Fugit, Time Flies, reunion lunch for old Bradfieldians, all of whom are 70 or more. The Tempus Fugit juniors are over 60, and they love being called juniors, at least in one area of their life. But we're having a virtual lunch at which I'm making a speech, and then we're dividing in separate rooms. I'm hosting a table. I'm not sure whether we'll be eating or whether it will be a liquid lunch for the old Bradfieldians who join us, but lockdown for them compared with the life they knew in Bradfield in the 1940s, I suspect would have been a breeze.
Absolutely. So both ends of the spectrum. I think that's a good snapshot of a headmaster's morning. Chris, I just wanted to really touch base and hear a little about life at Bradfield at the moment. I mean, we're obviously under the general restrictions, but is the general mood good?
Well, it is. I mean, it depends, of course, what your comparators are. This term compared with this term last year, there are lots of things that one would point out that we're missing enormously, lots of things that we're not able to do. This term compared with remote education in the summer term, everyone is focusing on the positives, and it's been really good to see the pupils have loved being back in school with each other, having live lessons in a not mediated through a screen. They had a lot of live lessons in the summer, but they were all mediated through a screen. Obviously, the opportunity, even at distance, to do pair work, to collaborate, to run around the playing fields. We've had a few school matches. That won't be possible, of course, now under lockdown too. But concerts with 20 people in the audience, all sitting 2 meters apart wearing a mask. It's still a live audience. So overwhelmingly, we've noticed the positives, not the negatives. But if you take a longer perspective, of course, there's lots we're missing that we can't wait to return to completely normal operation at some future stage.
Yeah, no, absolutely. But as you say, I mean, no better place for them at the moment than with their friends and, continuing education in real face-to-face as opposed to through a screen.
Yeah, I mean, the greatest challenges of this period actually have been stopping people doing what comes so naturally to them. And so, we've got all our one-way systems, and we've got desks that are there a metre plus. We can't do 2 meters in every classroom, but they're regimented lines of desks. But pupils tend to congregate. Staff tend to congregate. They want to spend time together. So stopping people do what comes naturally to them is a significant practical challenge. Which underlies perhaps the much greater challenge, which is the anxiety and the uncertainty, which erodes, depending on the person, erodes everyone's confidence at this time. The lack of knowledge of what the future may hold for them hits different people differently, but certainly weighs heavily on some shoulders.
And actually that ties in very neatly with, I mean, Bradfield, I feel are heralded as being very strong on their pastoral side and mental health. I mean, you've got the most incredible sort of infrastructure on that. I mean, it is our current times, it probably sounds obvious, but I mean, are you upping that, or are you just much more aware of keeping a close eye on mental health?
Most things in schools, most schools are in a sense maxed out. We're all running at capacity. The children are very busy, the staff are very busy. Therefore, when you up things, what you up is probably the priority you give them in amongst everything you're doing, rather than throwing loads of new resource at it, because there isn't actually, I mean, the most precious resource in a busy boarding school is time. And so it's dedicating more of our time to it rather than necessarily doing lots of new things. So right back to remote education, the tutorial conversation one-to-one with a pupil's tutor, remaining part of the house pastoral group, making sure that we remained a talking school, which is our mantra, and a school where people are able to talk about how they're feeling, and not just what they're doing, but talking about challenge, talking about difficulty, talking about struggling. Prioritizing that is the single most important thing. Absolutely. Of course, there are some new initiatives as well, but those are almost secondary to focusing on doing what we already did, but even more of it.
And how do you... Oh, I'm so sorry, that's me. Hold on.
Not at all.
That just proves it's live. How does... I've got a slightly vested interest in this question. One side of my family had a long history at Bradfield. In fact, my grandfather was there, uncles and cousins. I just wonder how you think the old and the new sort of complement or reflect each other, because I think it's quite an interesting, the journey of the school is always an interesting one. And I think, I just love your thoughts on how you think, you know, the old Bradfield has sort of integrated into the new.
Well, I mean, your grandfather would, like the people at lunch, I think, recognise a lot of the values of the school, as well as recognising the physical location, or at least the heart of the school. They'd be shocked by some of the, you know, the new science block or whatever. But they would recognise those values quite quickly. And so I think that schools have a character which in certain senses is quite difficult to shift. Bradfield is a kind environment. We're in this lovely, you know it only too well, you know, our lovely wooded valley with our two-storey buildings. I've written about it on our website. I think that it's an environment which is a naturally warm, welcoming, nurturing environment. It's quite difficult to be edgy in the Pang Valley. And so I think those traditions and those values are handed down from generation to a generation and are actually kind of hardwired into our environment. And yet, alongside that, I think there is a real sense of sort of freshness and a sense of momentum and a sense of openness to change. Bradfield's not hidebound by tradition. It's a very relaxed school. It's a very informal school in lots of ways. And I think that the thing that perhaps surprises the old Bradfieldians is that when they hear it is you know, fully co-educational. And when they hear that there are now 800 pupils and they knew 500, they assume it will be a radically different place. And yet they come here and there's immediately a lot that they can relate to and that they can feel very comfortable with. But we are more forward-looking and we're more outward-looking than I think was ever the case, and more ambitious too for ourselves without being proud. I think Bradfieldians are very, very ambitious for themselves, but they don't take themselves too seriously.
Well, I think you also have mentioned in a previous speech about sort of integrity over entitlement, which I think was a very sort of succinct way of putting it. It's quite a nuance, but I think it's, you know, handled well. I think it makes the person, doesn't it?
Undoubtedly. I mean, it's a remarkably grounded pupil body, clearly, in socioeconomic terms. You know, we're working with very privileged young people, but young people who are aware that with that privilege comes responsibility, and young people who are aware how lucky they are, and one doesn't have to ram it down their throats. But they are remarkably grounded and more aware of their outside of the world beyond Bradfield, I think, than any previous generation. I think it's a good thing that, you know, this generation, I really resent when they're sort of typecast as snowflakes and they receive quite a lot of criticism. But I think they are more in tune with the needs of their world and the problems of their world, and more concerned to do something about it than any generation I've taught, and certainly than me, or I hesitate to say my generation, maybe it was just me, but than the atmosphere when I was in school.
And what sorry, what was the leader? What was your sort of journey to where you've come today? I mean, teaching generally, is that something that was in the family, or is it, have you been
No,
left
I mean
field?
my mother was a ballet teacher,
Right.
but she was a dancer first and foremost, who ended up teaching dancing. I mean, I was teaching before I decided to teach. Back in the day, with seventh term Oxbridge as it was, I was doing an extra term after my A levels, and a local prep school had a teacher retiring at Christmas, and it was a French teacher, so contacted my headmaster and said, "Do you have somebody to teach French for 2 terms?"
Right.
So I left school on December the 15th, and I was teaching Common Entrance French on January the 8th, and I did that for 2 terms, and I loved it. So what I particularly loved was effectively the pupils, the energy, the excitement, the passion for learning. I had had some great teachers. I had benefited from, you know, I was very lucky with my own education, and there's no question that my teachers were great role models, and in a sense they inspired me. But it had never occurred to me to be a teacher
No.
at all until I did it in my gap year, and then reading modern languages. I spent a year abroad, and that year abroad I was teaching in 2 Italian state schools, and I realized I enjoyed it enormously. I went off to do my research, and I was whilst doing my doctorate doing quite a lot of university teaching and lecturing. And so it wasn't until I was 30 I actually applied, or 29, I applied to a school that was Uppingham, a school, you know, a secondary school. I think that's when it became a career rather than just what I happened to be doing.
A happy accident, exactly.
But yeah, a happy accident. And schools have indulged my hobbies, and that sounds terribly sort of self-indulgent, but it's not. They've kept me, I hope, fresh and excited and challenged and learning lots of new things, loads of new skills as a headmaster, loads of different subjects I've taught. So I've remained a learner at heart, although I am now called a teacher.
Fantastic. And what are your, I mean, I think you've answered some of them, but I mean, what are your passions in life? I mean, other than education and being, I mean, it's a very multifaceted role. So I guess you're covering an awful lot of ground, but what do you do, I guess, just to sort of relax and in your spare time, if there is such a thing?
Well, one of the reasons there isn't too much of that is because I'm not very good at relaxing in my spare time. And, you know, this sounds like kind of virtue signaling. It's like, you know, my greatest fault is I'm a perfectionist. That's a shocking interview answer.
That old chestnut, exactly.
But, you know, my wife and indeed my chairman of governors are quick to tell me, you don't need to read those books that you sort of read that are work related. You could just read a good old novel, or you could spend more time on the golf course. So I enjoy sport. I've done a lot of running recently, never been something I enjoyed. I used to swim, but this year that's been harder. I love doing things with my children and going to galleries, and I go to the theatre, and sadly, and travel. Lots of the things I like doing are the very things COVID doesn't let me do.
No,
so
I know.
Instead of theatre, opera, ballet, I'm probably via my mother. I love going to all of those. I've done quite a lot of it online, although more screen time isn't really what you'd prescribe for me.
No.
But I remain quite broad in my interests, and I do still read novels, but I also read the sort of social studies and you know, thought makers of the day, and some of the books that come out from economics to philosophy, because a lot of it ties in actually to my professional life.
And on the subject of sort of screens versus novels, I wonder how at Bradfield generally you juggle this constant sort of conflict, I guess, between keeping teenagers connected, but now more than ever, but also making sure they look up around the world and not just down. How do you? What's your take on that?
Well, number one, it is essential. I mean, I never believed video games were going to turn us all into axe murderers, my generation, you know, because we're playing violent games. I don't think that in and of itself, social media is necessarily as evil as it's often you know, cast. However, it's what you're not doing if you are spending hours online. It's the things it displaces which worry me most. And that isn't just reading, although that matters to me. It's actually human interaction. It's actually interacting with people who are not like you, because online you will tend to interact more with people who are like you.
Yeah. No, that's very true.
Therefore, institutionally, yes, we legislate, but more importantly, we educate. I mean,
Yeah.
we legislate in as much as phones are taken in at bedtime. The first year have their phones very little, or devices, I should say, taken in at bedtime. The first year need their computers around school, but they don't need their phones around school, so those are restricted. So we try to initially, through specific measures, help them make good decisions for themselves. Ultimately, however, you can't be Canute. This tide has come in. The child who hands one phone in will have another one, and then another one, and then another one, all with dummy SIM cards if they're that desperate.
Yeah.
So actually educating people is more important or more valuable for the long term. And we do that in lots of different ways, formally through wellbeing lessons, informally through tutorials, through regular discussion of the amount of screen time and what people are doing online, and most importantly of all, by having some really good competing attractions.
Yes.
And we are a school in that beautiful setting I described. There aren't many there isn't a high street to tempt you here, even if there were any shops open. And pupils get out and they do things. So primary experience lived with friends is valued, and it's pretty cool to be engaged and to be busy rather than to be disengaged and to be grungy around Bradfield. That's the prevailing air. Of course, some teenagers just want to tune into their phone. But the Bradfield diploma encourages in years 10 and 11 a breadth of activity.
Yes, I was going to ask you about that.
So it's I mean, also just one final thing, I happily come to the diploma. We made a conscious decision to invest in our common rooms in the boarding houses rather than investing in the individual rooms. We're doing both. Everything gets refurbed on a regular basis. But in terms of new investment, transformative investment, we wanted to make some really fantastic common rooms as places where pupils will gather.
Yeah.
Rather than some really fantastic rooms where they will atomize and get buried in their device.
Yeah.
Boarding houses now have phone-free moments of the day or phone-free areas of the house, and that's via the pupils often. They've set that up to make sure that's an area where people will socialise. So sorry, very rambling answer, but
no, it's not. I think it's absolutely right. I think you're offering a very, you're accepting it, but also offering a fantastic alternative.
A couple of years ago, I was a sort of co-signatory of a letter that was written by one of my fellow heads to the Times about the danger of social media, particularly on teenage mental health, particularly amongst girls. Thrilled, delighted to get a letter published in the Times, and underneath it there was a much better one by Clarissa Farr, who was High Mistress of St Paul's at the time, and so the line is hers, not mine, and I was really cross that she'd come. But is this the asbestos of our generation? Will we, in 20 years' time, look back and say, what were we doing allowing that? And it's on our watch, and we've got to do everything we can to keep things in balance.
No, absolutely. Is there a typical, I mean, for prospective parents watching this and getting a soundbite of Bradfield, is there a typical Bradfield child? At entry point?
No, I mean, no, there isn't. There are things they will have in common, and by and large, they're people who get snuck in and do lots of things. We assess, we now assess in year 6 as well as in year 7, and indeed when we assess for the 6th form, in the broadest possible way, and we want people who are going to be net givers to the community. So although the ISEB pre-test is part of that, and although for 6th form entry there are maths and English tests and we have minimum GCSE grades, fundamentally we want somebody who is going to come and get better academically wherever they are. And so it's all about progress, it's all about value added. And because we're not a league table school, because we're a value-added school, we therefore can, when we assess, not only look at academic ability, but look at everything else, which isn't just, are you a brilliant cellist, or do you have a great drag flick, or are you a star actor? It's what will you bring as a person? What will you bring with your attitude? What will you bring with your positivity? What will you bring with the manner you go about your learning? Our whole assessment model is designed to try to find people who are passionate and engaged and interested in something, preferably a number of things, and who along with that have an academic ability that's going to allow them to flourish here. But it's not putting that first and foremost. So there are a lot of all-rounders. there are a lot of people who are really passionate about academic life, but there's a lot of people who are really passionate about a different area that the school offers. But I mean, the line I've given, and we proudly say one Bradfield, many Bradfieldians, it is a pretty diverse pupil body. I talked about the privilege of them, but there's quite a breadth here. We have a strong bursary program which supports people who are not all from one socioeconomic background, and we have people who are very quiet and very retiring and very shy and are brilliant at their piano, or brilliant at their maths, as well as confident all-rounders who have lead parts in plays. So helping people become more like themselves rather than more like Bradfield College is what we want.
Not a blueprint, absolutely. No, I think that, and that equips them for life, doesn't it? Because you're going to be mixing with all sorts of different people through your life. You've just got to start to understand who you are.
Yeah, and having the confidence in yourself, having an appropriate measure of self-esteem, not to be overbearingly full of oneself. So again, sort of self-esteem and arrogance is a narrow line, like integrity and entitlement. You can easily slip from in the wrong direction. But helping people to be comfortable in their own skins for a generation who often are uncomfortable in their own skins is perhaps the single most important thing about educating them. So you have the best set of certificates in the world and the best exam results in the world. If you're not actually comfortable with who you are, that's not a recipe for long-term success.
No, agreed. And Chris, something that perhaps people don't know about you, is there something, a hobby or an activity or interest? I mean, perhaps it's the arts, I don't know.
If my pupils were watching, they'd find it interesting that I like going to the ballet. I suspect that will be news to one or two of them.
You might hear about that.
I did actually have ballet lessons from, not from my mother, but from the person who taught my mother, and she was, a fellow of the Royal Academy, and so that's very much been part of my life, but probably hasn't been foregrounded.
No.
And the funny thing I find now is that I almost have to sort of tell pupils that I do know a bit about history of art, and I know a bit about languages, and I've actually coached quite a lot of sport, because I think they just think I walk around in a suit and smile at people and type on my computer and sometimes look a bit cross if their top button's undone. So I think there's a lot of me that pupils don't necessarily know, but the biggest surprise might be dance.
Right, ballet, absolutely fantastic. We did touch very briefly on your bursary. I mean, the bright futures and sort of funding for not only your amazing facilities, which are quite outstanding, but also, as you say, to help those either who hit hard times, who are already in the system, and indeed support those life-changing bursaries for those who wouldn't consider being in the system without assistance. It's become hugely important for independent schools generally, but I think specifically Bradfield are very keen on this.
Yeah, we're very keen on it, and I think in many ways I think it's always been really important, and it's become all the more important as issues of affordability. It's a matter of record. Boarding school fees have outstripped inflation of salaries over the last 20 years, and there is a danger that you are attracting a narrower and narrower tranche, and that's not a good educational experience for the pupils who are here. So it's not about satisfying the Charity Commission and preserving charitable status. It's about actually offering a great education, and a great education necessitates diversity, necessitates breadth. We don't have as many overseas pupils as many schools, and sometimes I worry we don't have enough for the global world that the pupils are joining. If you include the international pupils who live in London with the overseas pupils, then actually we start to look more like the world they're joining. Exactly the same would be true if we're preparing people for the outside world. If we want them to be normal people in a normal world, we've got to be as normal as we can. And so the impact that it has upon the school community, to have some young people who embrace the opportunities here with a thirst, with an enthusiasm, with a passion that it's an absolute joy for the other pupils to see that. The peer effect of this education, as well as the fact that we are educating leaders of tomorrow and people who will go out and change the world and lead the world. I think for that reason, we are duty bound to try to educate as broadly as we can for the sake of all of the pupils in the school. It's not a sort of charitable act for pupils who couldn't do it otherwise. It is something much broader than that. So we have set about, over several years now, but increasing focus on raising as much money as possible, not just for life-changing bursaries, of whom there are 30 or so pupils in the school at any stage on a very high fee remission, between 90 and 100, or indeed more if they need uniform and support with equipment and so on of the fees, but also across the full range. Our scholarships are means tested, so there isn't a single financial remission for scholarships that isn't means tested. So pupils of ability we like to bring here if we can afford it, and that's why we're raising as much money as we can.
Yeah, and you've got amazing support from Bradfield families, haven't you? I mean, it's a well-known formula.
We had every Saturday morning I do a prospective parent visits, currently online, still live, but obviously used to be making a speech to a group of 44 families every week, and after me a different pupil speaks every week. And a pupil a couple of years ago who stood up and spoke after me finished his speech with, "Bradfield has taught me not just how to make a living, but how to make a difference." And I kind of went weak at the knees. This was somebody who had benefited from a bursary here, and who's standing up in front of his own peer group, all of those tour guides, saying that we had taught him how to make a difference, made me think it's all worth it for that. And if
absolutely.
Leave, and
wonderful. Chris, just to draw things to a close, sadly, because I'm conscious of your time, not mine. We've talked about lots of themes. Do you have a life motto that you have at the forefront of your mind? Do you stick to a sort of a mantra of...
I don't. I regularly have to remind myself, and I use the Latin festina lente, make haste slowly, because I'm quite a driven person, and I often need to slow myself down. A colleague, when I left my previous school, when I left Marlborough, a colleague who did research on Renaissance sort of mottos and emblems, did a picture of a watermill and put underneath it "Nunquam desiret rotum avendo," which is kind of the moving wheel never ceases, and that was how he summed me up. So I try and slow myself down, but without ceasing to want to see change and see development.
And lots more to do by the sounds of things. I mean, it sounds like you're not one to sit back on your laurels.
No, I mean, schools like this have got here because they have continually adapted, they have continually changed, and we continually need to make ourselves relevant to a world that's moving pretty fast. And that's of course, parents will choose us because they want some competitive advantage for their children, and we are, they are our customers, and we are a service provider, and we need to make sure we're doing that. It runs much deeper than that for me, though, as you will have heard. There is a sort of moral and a values-based dimension to it. We are preparing people to go out and be the leaders of the world that my children and grandchildren will live in. And unless we move with that world, unless we change, and indeed unless we stay wherever we can ahead of the curve, we're going to be still preparing people to go and run the empire and which is what these schools were set up and did brilliantly in the 19th century. That's
quite a responsibility all round, but you're doing a fantastic job, and really grateful for your time and to give people a little insight into the world that Bradfield is. So thank you.
Thank you very much indeed for the opportunity. It is a privilege to speak to you, but no, it's a privilege to educate young people. They are a joy, and it's great having them back in the school.
Wonderful. Thank you, Chris. Many thanks. Enjoy the rest of your half term.
Bye-bye.